This is Reverend Eric, and I'm offering a new online class called The Magical Philosophy of Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa. This class explores Agrippa's theory of divine light as illustrated in the 3 books of occult philosophy. Together we will examine divine light's role in interior and exterior perception, an essential foundation for understanding the practice and theory of image magic. Learn how active perception with the inner senses is core to Agrippa's magical philosophy, and learn techniques for empowering magical images using this theory of divine light. To learn more and enroll, visit arnemancy.com/classes. That's arnemancy.com/classes. I'll see you there.
Speak the charm of make.
There will come a time on the planet Earth when science and technology will be long forgotten. When wizards will rule the world.
This is the Arnemancy Podcast. Join your host, Reverend Eric, and his diverse array of amazing guests in an exploration of tarot, magic, the occult, and the history of Western esotericism. The Arnemancy Podcast exists thanks to the support of generous listeners like you. Please consider supporting this podcast for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/arnemancy. Welcome back to the show. This is Reverend Eric, and my guest today is Jacob Budenz, a queer author, multidisciplinary performer, educator, and witch with an MFA from the University of New Orleans and a BA from Johns Hopkins, whose work focuses broadly on the intersection of otherness and the otherworldly. The author of magic realist short story collection Tea Leaves and poetry chapbook Pastel Witcheries, Budenz has fiction and poetry in traditional print journals, including Slipstream and Assaracus. Okay. Zeitgeisty online journals, including Taco Bell Quarterly and Wussy Mag, and lauded anthologies by Mason Jar Press and Unbound Edition. In addition to writing, Jake is the front person for Baltimore-based psychedelic witchpop darlings Moth Broth, and has received awards and accolades for original theater work, including a new adaptation of Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita, and an original cabaret play about immortality and the cultural icon of the witch, Samantha, a Dreambaby Cabaret. Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Very happy to be here, Reverend Eric.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. I have to say, your description of Moth Broth would also make a really good band name. Psychedelic Witch Pop Darlings. I think it could be an excellent band name. So we're going to talk about a few different things today. We're going to start by kind of getting into your practice of Greco-Roman witchcraft and where that comes from and how you've sort of developed it and what it kind of means to you. But then I think the thing that will be super interesting to build on that will be talking about the intersection of art and witchcraft and how you have practiced that in your writing and perhaps music and things like that. So, Greco-Roman witchcraft. When you first approached me and sent me that description, my mind immediately went to the PGM. But I had to stop and be like, wait, PGM, I don't know if we can really call PGM witchcraft in the sense that it gets used today, since it was more... Since the theory is that it was mostly like, priests in the off season going town to town doing, peddling their wares. Whereas witchcraft kind of has an implication of like otherness and transgressiveness that other forms of magic don't really have. So can you tell us sort of where Greco-Roman witchcraft kind of comes from or the things that inspire you there?
Yes, so I think you're hitting on something about Greco-Roman magic that's like one of the most important descriptions in like any of my scholarly or academic work or courses or presentations, which is the difference between Hellenic spiritual practices, which to a contemporary person probably look and feel very witchy, versus what would have been considered sort of witchcraft at the time. So in the Greco-Roman world, until late Roman period, there wasn't really a word for a witch. necessarily, or as we have it, but as I would say Radcliffe Edmonds III and others define witchcraft for the Hellenic world, it is any kind of spiritual practice that was non-normative. And there was overlap, as you said, kind of transgressive. There was overlap between the two because spells and curse tablets would invoke, deities that were part of the sanctioned pantheon. But it was basically a way for an everyday person that is not a spiritual authority to kind of exert their will over the world. And so there is a major distinction at the time between who was supposed to be practicing spirituality or an authority on it or petitioning and so forth, and then who was actually doing it, which was kind of everybody in different strata of life in the Greco-Roman world. Lots of people were practicing sort of spiritual practices that were not sanctioned by sort of government or religious authorities. So when we think about some of the sort of flagship practices from an archaeological perspective, we think about lead curse tablets, so people would scrawl their will and these incantations on these sheets of and then sometimes roll it up and put a nail through it. A lot of times they would bury the curse tablets in a graveyard. That's kind of one of the spookier practices, but also practices of sympathetic magic and things like dolls or statues that you would exert your will over. Sympathetic magic is one of my favorite kind of cross-cultural things that appears in places that didn't have a lot of cultural exchange, but Greco-Roman magic was
everywhere.
Yeah, all over the place. And then something really interesting to me about cultural exchange between Egypt and the Greco-Roman world was in both cases, kind of non-normative spiritual practices involved a little bit of appropriation from the other culture's normative spiritual practices. So Greco-Roman curse tablets, for instance, would kind of exoticize Egyptian spirituality. But on the other hand, the same thing was happening in Egypt to people who were not religious authorities, where they were kind of exoticizing Greco-Roman deities and entities. So there was a weird witchy cultural exchange where they were both kind of exoticizing each other through the lens of witchcraft. So there's a lot there.
So that's a really interesting take on it, especially since over time that kind of turned into almost a religious syncretism, right? Where you might start by stealing the gods of the country across the Mediterranean Sea, but 150 years later, that god might become part of a mainstream god and be worshipped in a normal temple and stuff. And that's fascinating that it happened sort of in the sense, or that one of the channels that it must have happened is through sort of a sense of, magic. It was a transgressive religious practice because it was not normal. I have another question about this. One of the interesting archaeological things about this, the magic from back then is stuff like the Defixiones, the curse tablets. There are tons and tons and tons of them. And you described it as kind of a spookier practice, where it would get buried in graves or put in the bottom of wells and things like that. But do you think it was common enough that it wasn't really considered super spooky? Was it kind of do you think it ever reached sort of a level of everyday superstitious practice? Every day you went to the Colosseum, you'd get a sheet of lead and write a little curse tablet and shove it in a temple on your way there. Did it become that common?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, and this is where some of it comes a lot into my teaching practice in a completely, I wouldn't say entirely unspiritual way, but in the sense of there's a lot of, this is such a juicy academic topic for me and for a lot of other people, because there is witchcraft and witches as they appear in ancient Greek and Roman literature, and witchcraft as it was practiced. And there's a lot of disparity between who is depicted practicing witchcraft in stories and who archaeological evidence suggests was practicing it in real life. So in a way, it was very commonplace. In another way, at least literary evidence would suggest it was very stigmatized for people without divine blood, like a Medea or a Circe, to be trying to exert magic and will and pharmaca and blending herbs in this way. So in a way, like, it was both very common, and literary evidence would suggest very taboo to do things like this, especially for educated people and wealthy people who were also engaging in witchcraft. Absolutely. There's so much evidence of like wealthy people trying to cast spells on other people. But in polite society, it became kind of normalized to make fun of people who practice witchcraft and to associate witchcraft with otherness, with othered people. So with women, in the Roman world, more in the Roman world with old women, the sort of crone archetype didn't really become a literary thing so much until the Roman world, but like a lot of the authors who are critical or lampooning or railing against witchcraft in one way or another, it's very often associated with people of the lower classes, with foreigners, with women, with anyone experiencing any kind of sort of alterity in that society. And again, archaeological evidence suggests it really was everybody. If you received a spell or an aspect of pharmaca from a foreigner, it was maybe considered a little more credible, because Western society loves to exoticize other cultures and add legitimacy to their mysticism or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not sure that it's only Western society that does that.
Absolutely. Same with Egypt. I mean, Egypt was doing the same kind of... Egypt is physically the West, but it's not like white Europe or whatever. They were doing the same thing in the other direction at the time.
I was actually just thinking of some of the crypto-Christianity that was happening in Japan, like 2,000 years after what we're talking about. But, when Christianity was made illegal in Japan, there was this movement of Christians creating these sculptures that looked like Buddhist saints or whatever. But if you look closer, they've got all this Christian iconography in them. And it was this sort of like, again, it's exoticized otherness.
Yeah, and same, I mean, like, so much of Celtic paganism was subsumed into like saint worship and things like that. It's why I would say Imbolc is probably my favorite pagan holiday, because it's like the saint that was so transparently just like a goddess that they wanted to let people keep worshiping, in my opinion. And they were like, yes, the goddess Bridget. Oh, but actually she was a Christian woman named Bridget, and now it's her holiday. And it's like this inexplicable Christian holiday that is kind of worshiping a deity of fire and dawn. So a lot of that happened, in Brittany and all of that, and through, the kind of, unfortunately, the sort of genocide and destruction of Celtic indigenous practices, but also we're imposing this religion on all of you, and we understand that there are things that you're not going to give up worshiping on, so we're just going to kind of call them saints. Like, I'm very fascinated with that, which is reminding me, what you're saying is reminding me of like that. Like, I think a lot of saints personally are just adapted pagan deities that they were like, you can keep worshiping them or whatever.
I've been really fascinated, and actually I've been leading a Walpurgisnacht celebration, which is kind of something that happens in the other direction, right? Like it was May Day, so it was a pagan thing that got super Christianized by, Saint Walpurga, and then totally kind of reversed. And Walpurgisnacht now is like a spooky witch night, where it's I don't know, it's the badminton game of what's witchcraft.
Halloween for the spring.
So you mentioned a few sources, like primary sources, that have been kind of important in the development of your practice and understanding of Greco-Roman witchcraft. I think, but before we get into that, like I really enjoyed what you wrote to me about these things, and I love the kind of the spread of pieces that you suggested. One of the things that I think is always important to keep in mind when looking at this kind of stuff is there's sort of a line between reconstruction and what's the other R word that we use, like revitalization, or it's hard for us to reconstruct these practices entirely because so much of it was oral tradition, or so much of it was almost kind of like transitory in nature, like it wasn't around for very long before getting subsumed into bigger culture. So maybe when you're talking about some of these things, you can talk about how those have sort of influenced you beyond kind of like your academic life and into more of your personal practice and personal understanding of the philosophy behind it. And the first is a piece by Theocritus.
Yes, and this is one. This is the perfect intersection of like my academic pursuit of this and my spiritual philosophy around art making. Because when I first encountered Idyll II by Theocritus, which is colloquially known as The Sorceress, but is just his second found Idyll poem. It's a sort of monologue poem from the perspective of a witch named Simetha. She's sort of, the play that I wrote and performed is inspired by her, but it's not her story necessarily. But it's a vengeful love spell it's basically a monologue poem. And for me, I think I encountered this at about 20 years old. And I was already pretty actively identifying kind of broadly as a witch and identifying basically myself as an artist, as a witch, which is to say, if I could sum up that philosophy of spirituality, it's that to me, writing and reciting a poem is an incantation all the time, if that's what you want it to be. So is performing a set of music, so is performing a play. It's like a set of ritual actions that's meant to achieve an intangible and often unseen effect. So I already kind of had that in my brain at 20 years old, but I had never read a poem that was just a spell. And it kind of like expanded my whole world of poetry making and how I interface with presenting my writing in public, of like, oh, if I read a poem in front of people, I'm casting a spell. So Theocritus really, ironically, really opened my brain. And it's ironic because from a scholarly perspective, Theocritus was probably making fun of young women who cast spells on people. There are a lot of things tonally in the poem and in the character of Simetha and in her relative credibility in that poem that suggest that Theocritus was not necessarily pro-witchcraft, whether he thought it was something frightening or whether he thought it was something to be laughed at. Is a topic of a lot of scholarly debate. But for me at 20, for me as a queer person, and no offense to any men listening, but for me as someone dating men at 20 years old, a young woman casting an angry spell on a fuckboy who made a lot of promises he didn't keep to her. Not that I have ever done that. I don't cast spells on people, but the desire to do something to get back at a man, I was like, yeah, totally. Yeah. I'm totally with you. Yes, I'm grinding this powder and it's his bones I smear, and all of this, like, she's having kind of a ritual catharsis around not just getting dumped, but getting abandoned, getting ghosted. I mean, Simetha, Idyll II is about getting ghosted, which 2,000 years later at 20 years old, I was like, I've had many a man seduce me and make me promises about how much he is interested in me and then completely disappear. Like, her story is my story right now. At 30, that's not the case. I might be the ghost more often than not now. But,
all those Siamethas out there after you now.
Exactly. But like, yeah, I think that poem in particular really opened up my world philosophically, even though the original author was at least to an extent sympathizing with this character, but also kind of lampooning the way that she was handling it. And there's even deeper lore, like Lambert's Desperate Simetha makes the argument that by the standards of the day, her ritual was like completely botched and horrible and stupid, and like it contains all these contradictions that anyone who knew anything about magic would know wouldn't have worked. I don't get too much I get in the weeds with that with my students. Personally, a man making fun of young women wrote something that really resonated with my spiritual practice and still resonates with my spiritual practice, which is that, the creation of a poem is both a spell and a catharsis. You are attempting to have an effect on the world around you, and also you are having a catharsis for yourself. And that's what Simetha, to me, is doing in that poem. So it changed the way that I write poetry. It changed the way that I perform for people. And it's not to say that I have spiritual and witchy practices that are not art making, that are like, elements of moon worship and divination and like mostly Celtic and Greco-Roman magic type of stuff in my kind of private life. But in my public facing ritual and ritual magic, poems like Idyll II really influenced how I make work and what I view the role of the artist as a witch, basically.
I think that's the stuff that you said really makes sense. It's interesting when you had a spot there where you were talking about Simetha's practice in the poem, but when I was hearing you, it sounded almost like you were kind of describing something that Theocritus was doing also. Because, he also, even though he might be writing this poem to like make fun of a young woman, he's still invoking imagery and creating this world where this sort of thing is happening. And it's almost like his poem had as much of an effect on you as Simetha in the imaginal world of Theocritus did too. Which is kind of an interesting 2-level thing happening there, huh?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, that and Euripides' Medea are both, I say that they're lampooning or condemning aspects of femininity, but in both cases, there are people who consider both authors sort of proto-feminist in the sense that there were not really male writers writing about or from the perspective of women with any kind of sympathy. And even if both the character of Medea in Euripides and the character of Simetha in Idyll II are criticized or tonally like made not credible in certain ways, there's also a lot of sympathy for what they're going through. It's very clear, at least on some level, that the writers sympathize with these characters. And maybe it doesn't condone everything that they do, but like there is definitely, reading the poem now, it is very clear that Delphus, Simetha's ex-lover, is in the wrong. If you read Euripides, especially with the presence of the chorus, it's very clear that Jason is in the wrong according to Euripides, and that he pretty much agrees with her up until she kills her own children, which from a historical perspective, interestingly, is not necessarily canon to the Medea myth. As far as we know, Euripides is the first person or first surviving work depicting Medea also killing her children. Most other versions of the myth. Yeah, so that's an interesting... Euripides either took that choice from somewhere else, had access to oral tradition that we don't have anymore, but regardless, it's the first surviving piece of writing where Medea does that, and previous versions of the myth that we still have don't have her killing her children. So it's an interesting choice on his part, but in both cases, I get so obsessed with this. I'm so sorry. That it's like
you do not need to apologize. I love that play.
Me too. It's one of my.
I mean, I would say, I read a lot of Greek tragedy in college, which was a zillion years ago now, and I think Medea was the one that always just stuck with me the most.
Me too.
I love the story of Medea. I've always been obsessed with that. So yeah, I mean, and honestly, Jason was such a dick.
Totally.
Those kids didn't deserve to get murdered, but Jason was such a dick.
Totally. And there are versions of the myth in Pindar's version of the story of the Argonauts. Oh, this is another intersection between these two works. So Simetha uses, she refers frequently to a magic wheel or a spinning wheel. Most archaeologists believe that this is a jinx wheel.
Okay, yeah. What's the Hecate wheel that crap, I can't remember what it's called. There's some tool that is associated with Hecate, which is some sort of like spinning wheel on strings that you would use as sort of like a contemplative device or a trance building device. And I can't remember what that thing is called.
Yeah, this one according to the scholars I've read about Idyll II, what Simetha is using would be called a jinx wheel, after the nymph Jinx, who attempts to, I think, seduce Zeus and then is turned into a type of bird. And it's a wheel that makes a very loud sound that people use and spin to make somebody fall in love with them. It's as far as the language goes, that's what scholars think Simetha would have been using. And in Pinder's version of the Jason and the Argonaut myth, Jason uses a jinx wheel. Aphrodite teaches Jason to use a jinx wheel to make Medea fall in love with him so that she'll do all the things that she does in her homeland to help him. And I don't know that that's necessarily canon either, but to me it contextualizes Medea's rage later in the play, which is that she has been bewitched by a person to fall in love with him. And in the Greco-Roman world, to be in love with someone is to be in pain and to be enraged and to be angry and to act kind of crazy and to be sort of lovesick.
And I mean, she betrayed her whole family and nation to run away with the Argonauts. And
chopped up her brother.
I know. Yeah, I mean, I suppose that might be a little bit of a red flag. Like, if you get into... Yeah. I mean, Medea was a very strong female character. Like, and the only way that anybody ever really showed strength in any of those old Greek myths is by chopping people up. So that's kind of what you got to do.
Right. Well, Odysseus comes home and commits wholesale slaughter to all these men who think that he's dead and are, by their own understanding, engaging legally in the courtship of a woman. And Odysseus is like, I'm still alive, baby. And the solution is killing every single one of you and having my son help me do it. And it's like, that's cool. Odysseus is a hero for killing dozens of people. I think dozens. I can't remember the exact number.
Oh, yeah. It was a really ridiculous number. Yeah.
And he's a hero.
I mean, yeah, hero. Hell, Achilles beat up a river.
Also gay icon, Achilles.
Also, yeah.
Yeah, I think that in any of these stories, it is weird the extent to which some of these like kind of monstrous women whose monstrosity was being lampooned or at least was under scrutiny really resonated with me. But I was like, obviously I would never do any of the stuff that they're doing, but like I know what it's like to feel this way about something a man has done to you. Maybe we all do. Maybe we all know how it feels to feel betrayed in love and to want to like destroy,
The last piece that you talked about was the Golden Ass, Apueleius. That's a different kind of story, mostly told from the man's point of view. I don't remember all the details of it, but is there a female character in that story? Does the main character, the guy who gets turned into a donkey? Oh yeah, of course, he gets turned into a donkey. Yeah, he's. Can you tell us a little bit about that story's relationship with your practice, or how that inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Apueleius is more of a historical and academic exercise in the sense of like, there are a lot of, from the perspective of a fiction writer, and of course, fiction and storytelling is also myth making to me. As far as we know, the Golden Ass is the first surviving work of picaresque in Western society. So like we kind of, in Western society, we more or less owe the novel, as far as we know, probably it wasn't the first one, but it's the first surviving one, to this completely absurd, extremely horny story about a man who is really interested in witchcraft, goes to Thessaly to learn about witchcraft, and then it's very curiosity killed the cat. He gets turned into a donkey. He goes through a number of trials and tribulations as a result of it. And then in the end, there are a lot of women that he encounters along the way. But in the end, he is basically converted away from his curiosity about magic and inducted into the cult of Isis and Osiris. Isis appears to him, I think, in a dream, but also kind of on the beach, maybe not in a dream, and is like, I'm going to help you not be a donkey anymore, but you have to abandon your whoring ways and stop being interested in witchcraft and join my cult. And he's like, sounds great, and has kind of a religious conversion. But it's very farcical story. It's where we first get the image of the witch as like horny crone. There are witches. Yeah, there are witches of various ages, but like pretty much all but one of the witches that he encounters are pretty much cougars. Like they're all just like middle-aged or older women entrapping young kind of submissive men into an arrangement with them. And so it is in a way very not pro-witch as a work, but Apuleius's life was under scrutiny with respect to his own possible relationship to witchcraft. Apuleius as a figure, the other major surviving work of his is the Apologia, in which he is in a trial to defend himself against allegations of witchcraft from the family of a young woman who accused him of using witchcraft to entrap her into because she came from a lot of money and he benefited a lot from her money. And then her family was like, you cast a spell on her. And what follows is a trial in which Apuleius gets off scot-free by kind of ironically demonstrating an extremely in-depth knowledge of magic and witchcraft that to an external reader would suggest that he probably was a witch, or at least was very interested in it from an academic perspective, but he weaponizes that knowledge within the confines of a legal system to get free. But so this is an ironic contrast to The Golden Ass, in which a character experiences sort of a religious conversion away from witchcraft and into a sanctioned sort of cult of a goddess and then ultimately a god, whereas in real life, this was a person who was accused of witchcraft and whose defense of witchcraft to the average scholar almost kind of proves that he was probably a witch, but he won the trial. So yeah. Apuleius is not as much integrated into my own magical practice or inspiration around magical practice so much as he's a really interesting historical figure of someone who was probably kind of a witch, and kind of got in trouble for it and saved himself. But but The Golden Ass is amazing. It's in the sense that all art making is a religious experience. For me, I do believe we kind of owe in the Western picaresque to Apuleius. It's also very experimental in form. It's very metafictional. The narrator is very untrustworthy. And then there are like several chapters where it's just the myth of Cupid and Psyche rendered in beautiful detail that he's hearing in a cave in the middle of the story. So there's a lot in there that's really interesting, and a lot that kind of has helped fill in some gaps about some of the surviving myths of the time and stuff. Like, I think it's the most comprehensive writing about Cupid and Psyche from the time period, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, not a super religious text for me. The Apologia kind of is, because there's knowledge about pharmaca. Well, he wouldn't have called it pharmaca in the Roman world, but there's knowledge about the practices of the time that I think can be very instructive for people who are curious about those practices. But also, Apuleius was he was like such a troll in a lot of ways, in my opinion. And the Apologia in tone is kind of trolly. It's a little bit wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Like, well, if I were a witch, I could have done this, 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 and this, but I didn't do that. So it's kind of it's like a pretty fascinating text for this, for Greco-Roman magic and what has survived. I should clarify my own witchy Greco-Roman practices are probably more in line with regular Hellenic spiritual practices. Like, I don't get into the lead curse tablets, and the kinds of potions and things that happened then are like pretty hazardous mixtures of materials that I probably wouldn't feed to anybody. I also probably wouldn't feed people a potion without their consent or any of that stuff. So some of the witchy stuff, it's like the way that it's aged is that, like, from a public health standpoint, it's like messing around with like strips of lead is like probably not something I would recommend to people without a lot of care and consideration. So I have absorbed some Hellenic spiritual practice and, you know, archetypes and deities that I work with and stuff like that. But not so much some of the taboo stuff. I have nothing against the taboo, but I am like, I don't know that I would mix those herbs together and try to feed it to somebody. I don't think it would be a very good idea.
There's definitely a consent issue there.
Exactly.
One of the things about Apueleius that I think is interesting, given some of the stuff we talked about earlier, is it involves the cult of Isis in Rome, or, you know, in the Roman Empire. And that's one of those things that must have started as kind of an otherness, right? Like people on the northern side of the Mediterranean taking practices or worship of Isis and probably having it as sort of like an illicit religious or witchcraft practice or magical practice that eventually became big and popular enough that it became another state cult.
It was so legit that for readers of the time, Apueleius converting to the cult of Isis would have been, the character Lucius, who is most definitely not Apueleius himself, whose name was also Lucius, or whatever.
But like, nobody can hear your finger quotes.
Right. Allegedly. So the character's name, the narrator's name is Lucius. Apuleius' full name is Lucius Apuleius, but it's a work of fiction. But Lucius converting to the cult of Isis would have really legitimized him as a character to people. Another fascinating thing about this book is that it does dovetail with other mystery cults that existed at the time that Apuleius was clearly condemning as well. There are a lot of there are a handful of orgiastic cults that Lucius as a donkey gets kind of enslaved by. Lucius just gets, when he's a donkey, subjugated by a lot of different kinds of people, and some of them treat him well and some of them treat him badly. And there's like definitely a cult of very horny people that get their hands on him for a while. There's a bunch of people that try to make him have sex with a woman in front of an audience. It's like really bawdy. I teach it to 18-year-olds too. They're like, okay, we're into the weird sex stuff. And they're like, I had to, in one of my classes on my Canvas course in the forum, publish a clarification about how normalized bestiality would have been in the Roman Empire. And I had a moment of leaving my body and being like, my life is that I'm posting a clarification in a community college class about bestiality. Like, cool. But
how normal was bestiality in the Roman Empire?
Not very. That's like kind of it was, Colosseum activity to torture and humiliate people sometimes, we believe. But where was I going with this? But one of the cults that Lucius encounters as a donkey that Apuleius seems to condemn has a lot of similarities to Christianity, which was not well enough established to be normalized yet. And he was like, and then there's this other mystery cult, and they're all so stupid and whatever. I'm not stupid, but he kind of really briefly lampoons the emerging cult that we believe ended up being Christianity, which is kind of an interesting thing about that text too. Or a mystery cult that probably through syncretism was absorbed into the practices of Christianity. It might have been like a Mithraean cult, which Roman Christianity kind of absorbed a lot of, like, people refer to Mithras as kind of proto-Christian in a way, but it's a chicken or egg argument. But anyway, a fascinating feature of this book is that Apuleius makes fun of what seems to be Christianity, and at the time was still kind of a fringe cult, as the cult of Isis probably was well before this book was written. And then, these cults just sort of rise to prominence.
by the time of Apueleius, I think wasn't there already a temple of Isis in Rome by then?
I think so. Yes,
Yeah.
I think so. I
Yeah.
think it was very in vogue to be into Isis and Osiris when Apuleius was writing this.
I think it's always in vogue to be into Isis and Osiris.
Me too. And Nephthys. Let's not forget Nephthys.
Yeah, let's
That's
not
another
forget
side of that
Nephthys.
story.
But we can forget Set, that jerk. Okay, so we've got a really, really good background of the stuff that has kind of inspired you to look into Greco-Roman witchcraft. You've also kind of given us some sort of like caveats or modifiers that sort of talk about how you may have adapted all this stuff to a more modern, less lead-based practice with probably fewer poisonous herbs, less heavy metals, less cursing, less coercive love magic. But throughout all of these, the concept of love magic has kind of been an ongoing and ever-present theme. Can you talk a little bit about how the impression that I get about love magic in the late classical world is that it was rarely friendly. A lot of the love magic was coercive, was sort of done without consent, was trying to warp other people's will. Like if it was effective, it was definitely a kind of a form of sexual violence almost.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk about how that sort of practice or that sort of theme, or just love magic in general, how can that possibly translate into a modern practice in a way that would be ethical?
Yeah, I mean, I think the short answer to that question is probably it can't. Love magic comes up a lot in our discussion, I think, because these literary texts are very rooted in exploring the question of love magic, which was a pretty narrow margin of Greco-Roman witchcraft, but it is the margin of it that is most represented in literature. So in short, I would say you're absolutely right. It's to me, in a lot of ways, sexual violence and regular violence, something that people will notice if they read Theocritus, as well as read curse tablets of what Radcliffe Edmonds III calls obtaining spells. This is a terminology for spells that are specifically meant to make somebody be in love with you, as opposed to a love spell that is meant to retain a lover or to restrain a rival or to improve. Also, it was considered love magic to like have aphrodisiacs and stuff like that. But obtaining magic, as Edmonds puts it, appears most in literature and is quite violent. And I think for the modern reader of something like Idyll II, immediately my students, for instance, are all like, well, Theocritus wants us to think Cymetha is bad because this spell is really violent. But historically speaking, love in the Greco-Roman world was violent, painful, causing of physical illness, literal love sickness. It was just believed that if you were in love with somebody, you were in physical pain and you were sick. So you'll notice in a lot of these obtaining spells, and then the cure for that is to have sex with the person. So you'll notice in a lot of curse tablets that are sort of the obtaining nature, there's all of these like, and may fire crunch against the bones of the object of my desire, and may there be crushing pain in their head and all of their hair fall out and all of this stuff. And it is quite just physically, these spells are quite physically violent. And so that, in and of itself, I think cannot be adapted to a contemporary practice. It also isn't really well adapted into a contemporary vision of what love is and what, lust is. So some of the violent nature of these spells is just sort of culturally motivated by how people viewed love and desire at the time. And then on the other side of that, in a contemporary sense, the only contemporary type of love spell I would personally condone, not to say other people are not free to do as they choose, is something broadly to attract a type of person to you, or a type of romantic relationship, or a type of feeling to be evoked within a relationship that's not person specific. And I will say the pop culture example of this, which is very cheesy, in Practical Magic, when she's like, I want a man who has one blue eye and one brown eye and can flip pancakes with one hand, or like whatever I'm paraphrasing, but that kind of, obviously not that's a very cheesy pop cultural reference, but a spell that's like, this is the type of relationship I would like to have, or this is the type of thing I would like to attract in my life. That's about as far as I would condone on a contemporary level any kind of love magic. And there is not much in the Greco-Roman tradition to pull from for that kind of magic that prioritizes consent and does not. There, a lot of the Greco-Roman love magic, there is an object of your desire. And that, to me, on a contemporary level, that's a type of magic I don't practice. The only magic that I will ever practice that involves a target is protection against somebody, or binding from harm, or things like that, which is a gray area even for some people. But so that was a very long-winded answer. The short answer is, if there are listeners out there being like, I am inspired to look into Greco-Roman love magic, do what thou wilt, etc. Don't say that I encouraged you to do it, because I don't think there's really an ethical way to do it.
Yeah, I would agree. But I do think that, I'm in the middle of reading Ancient Christian Magic, which is a collection of demotic spells from, a little bit later than what we're talking about. But there's a great chapter in there with love spells and love curses that is delightful to read, and you would be horrified by the idea of doing any of that to another human being. You're sort of like, oh my God, I want their penis to do what?
Totally.
Yeah.
There's a spell in Ogden. Daniel Ogden has a sort of a source book of different, it's not really a coherent text. It's just like, here's the categories of types of magic that we have surviving archaeological evidence for. And there's one type of spell called a vulva key in the Greco-Roman time, where it's like you make some kind of lotion to put on your vagina, and then when you have sex with a man, he'll never be able to have enough of you, and he will always want to have sex with you. Which to me is almost, that's kind of like, grayer to me, like not terrible. It's like, oh, I'm going to put a lotion on myself that, like, if he consents to having sex with me, it's going to be the best sex of his life, and he's going to want it for the rest of his life. That still, to me, I wouldn't condone. And also any of the herbal mixtures of the Greco-Roman period, just from a public health standpoint, I would not recommend that you put them. Yeah. Horrifying.
Yes. So you've mentioned you've done a lot of poetry writing. I know you do music. You've published a lot, an impressive amount of stuff.
Thank you.
And your magical practice, or your sort of like your spiritual life has had a really big impact on your art. And I can hear in your voice when you're talking about some of these classical texts, how much you've been kind of like influenced by art of the past. How have you sort of carried that thread through? Like, can you give us a little bit of detail, or maybe detail is the wrong word, but can you talk a little bit about how that magic has influenced your approach to art and the creation of art?
For sure. I mean, the first and I would say most direct connection between what we've been talking about and what I do is that after I read Theocritus, I started experimenting with spell as poetic form, which is not groundbreaking. I'm not the first poet to do that as sincerely as I'm doing it. But that was the mind-expanding thing for me. And when I set out to write a poem of that nature, I am not attempting to cast that kind of spell. I am attempting to build a world in which people sympathize with somebody that might have wanted to do that to themselves. So, for instance, in my poetry chapbook and in, I think Assaracus was the first place to publish it, I wrote a ritual when I was younger it was really a poem about femmes, or gay men or people who otherwise exist within the male gaze do horrendous things to their body to be appealing to men. And so it's a ritual summoning of a demon of plague to drink the fat from your body and be extremely skinny to be appealing to men. And obviously I do not want that for myself. I do not want that for anybody, but I have poems about that. A lot of my ritual poems or spell work poems are access points to explore sort of body horror related to the queer experience or to the trans experience or to the just gender queer experience. So that's kind of my poetic practice. There's not all of my poems are in the format of a type of spell, and there's certainly never rhyming spell. I don't really write rhyming poetry. I hardly even write rhyming lyrics in my band, or like I reticently write rhymes into our songs because it's technically pop music and you need to give people a little something that they can like feel
familiar
with. But
yeah, I think we call that the hook.
Yes. But like, so I'm, they're not like thrice to thine and thrice to mine type of spells. But I will describe a set of ritual actions through poetry that evokes things like that. I also think I view the practice of writing poetry and fiction as somewhat divinatory in my own life. And to what extent that is self-fulfilling prophecy, and to what extent that is a channeling of a warning or message about something that's going to happen in my life, or to what extent I am manifesting things that happen in the future, I don't have an answer to that question, but I certainly have.
I don't know if you've really explored this very much, but in the realm of chaos magic, there are quite a few artists and musicians who kind of explore that sort of thing in various forms of, like the idea of like the hyper sigil or sort of like art as a, reality bending construct sort of thing like that happens a lot out there. Yeah.
And one of the only reasons I don't call myself a chaos magician, which is probably what I am, is I think sometimes there's a certain connotation that goes with that. I would say there's a certain political connotation that can come with chaos magic that I don't identify with. And over the years, since I started performing ritual with my solo act, over the years, I have become much more conscious about not putting things out into the world that can be harmful while also producing ritual catharsis. So like my solo act is about 80% very spooky, almost Diamanda Galassi, like clangy piano covers. And then I read poem as ritual in between, sometimes light candles, sometimes talk about the cosmos and why what is going on in the cosmos might be resonating with what people are going through at the moment. It's a little culty. I admit it's a little bit culty, but it's all for the purpose of
amazing.
Catharsis.
I want to see this.
And people are
you coming to Portland anytime soon?
I would love to. I would absolutely love to. Actually, I am thinking about trying to do West Coast tour because I did a book tour last year, mostly through places that are drivable from Baltimore and like West Coast. I'm trying to come to the West Coast later in the year, but it's so for that act in the past. I have done rituals that are very dark. I have not engaged when I was like in my early 20s, for instance, I have not necessarily engaged in the kind of protective practices that would shield people from what I'm conjuring, nor have I protected myself. And so in that way, I was probably emphatically and exclusively a chaos magician when I was like 22. And then over the years, I've been like, if I'm going to do something that dark, I need to put a circle of salt around myself and also get like, I don't know, maybe not do that and take that on myself always. Cause I would do stuff like this and then I would be like physically sick for a couple days, or like, I used to do this like demon of lust ritual that people were really into, but then a few people were like I would have them participate in this Yiddish incantation and all of this stuff. But I've had a few people after I did that who willingly participated in it have 2 or 3 days later lovers quarrels or terrible dreams or things that they'll tell me, and they're not trying to call me out for it. They're like often very skeptical people, but they're like, something really crazy happened after you did that like thing, and we all did it and chanted with you. And ever since then I was like, oh, whoa, I need to maybe not, even if it's not a true spell and I'm just giving people bad dreams, like that's antithetical to what
that's
I want
a true
to be
spell.
doing. Yeah, so I'm a lot more careful, now, but, and I'm a lot more, regimented about explaining what I'm doing to people if I do something in public that I'm inviting them to participate in, and a little more regimented about what effect we want it to have together. So I'm a little less chaotic, but I do subscribe to the chaos magic view of like art is a bending of the world around you. And I put that into my work intentionally, knowing that even if I wasn't, I would still consider what I was doing to be a spell. So there is esoteric, supernatural, incantatory stuff in my work that pulls from a variety of spiritual traditions and mythic archetypes and things like that. But also just philosophically speaking, like my collection of short stories there's not an explicit spiritual practice in each story, but I would say pretty much every story contains some little sliver of esoteric philosophy or some kind of reflection on the reality of the hidden world and the relationship between what we experience in the world that is unseen and psychological, and like what is magical about the world and often goes overlooked or unseen and stuff like that. In a way, I consider my short story collection to be a bit of a spiritual manifesto, but it's also a collection of literary magic realist stories about, queer and gay people and trans people and whatever. Mm-hmm. So a lot to unpack. I just completely blabbered about a few different things that I do, but
I thought that was amazing. So let's back up and talk about a few of those things in particular. So you were talking a little bit about your solo act. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us, like, is it music and poetry? Like, what's sort of the form of it? What would people see if they were there watching you perform?
Yeah, most of it's rooted in music. I less so than my band. I consider it more performance art that uses music as the primary medium. So I will perform 5 to 7 songs usually, and in between each song I will almost certainly read poetry / spell work, and I will very often kind of narrativize what's happening spiritually, and I will very, very often start and end with some kind of invocation that people are invited to participate in but not required to. And that part of it is much less fixed than the rest. I have probably a repertoire right now of 30 to 40 songs. Very few of them are my own music, wow. And a lot of them are just songs I've learned over the years. And I will decide what songs I want to do based on what I want to do ritually, and I'll narrate it. Over the years, I've gotten enough feedback to understand that it helps if I narrativize what's going on spiritually, so I try to do that a little bit without over-explaining what I'm doing. So that's a music act, and it's usually just me and a piano and various ritual objects, sometimes candles, sometimes some incense. And the vibe of the music is usually like I'm clanging and crashing on the piano and singing in a sort of like haunted housey operatic, a wannabe operatic style.
Are there videos of this online?
Yes, it's hard. It's kind of hard to document, but on my Baker portfolio and on my website, I have a few like little clips. And then I have a few backing tracks that I'll perform with, because the other side of this act is sometimes I just like MC shows and put shows together where like I might not do a set, I might do a few like cabaret numbers that are like witchy and wacky. So there's another side of it that's just like I host shows, sometimes that I organize, sometimes that somebody else organizes, and I'll just dress up like a disgusting vampire and like sing with a backing track that I've made of like spooky music. I've been really into my one sort of singly song that I wrote last year is called Goth Bitch, and it's just like a 5-minute sort of making fun of myself for being a tacky, slutty goth. So that's fun and like much less ritualistic and much more like let's make fun of our tendencies to spiritualize our sluttiness a little bit. So it covers a lot of ground, but a traditional set for this act is me playing piano, singing, talking probably about the moon and the stars, and reading ritual poetry, and maybe lighting some candles or sprinkling some powders or whatever, depending.
Do you find difficulty in allowing sort of the formality and kind of like stiffness of your academic work and your academic approach to some of these classical sources, in letting that inspire your art? Like, how do you overcome that barrier between formality and the freedom you need to create?
Yeah, I think when I teach about witchcraft and magic, I view it kind of as a fun, in a way it's a manifestation too. I shouldn't say this on a hot mic, but like some of my students have left my witchcraft class being like, this class made me get really into witchcraft, and now I read tarot, which is not necessarily what I'm setting out to do. And I certainly would never admit that I'm setting out to do that. But even the class itself to me is so fun. I'm basically, when I teach this stuff, it's writing and literature. It's like writing and research. So I'm teaching students how to analyze texts, and we're having fun and interesting conversations about this stuff. And, it's not, in a way, it's very separate from my artistic practice in that, like, I'm also learning about it too by teaching it. I guess my academic pursuit of this is very fun for me, and I try to, with my students, I try to approach it in a very fun way. I choose it as an academic topic because I'm passionate about it, and because I think for first year writing students, it's something, even if they're not interested in the occult, makes a fun story for them to tell their friends, like, oh, in my English class we talked about like sex magic today. Like, to me it's like, it's almost, teaching these topics is almost performance art to me, in a different way of like, oh, I'm performing as like cool mom professor that teaches the kids about like this really horny Greco-Roman book about a guy that turns into a donkey or whatever. So I guess I'm very playful in how I present the work academically. And then a nice side effect is that it forces me to look into a lot more primary and secondary historical sources about these practices. And then like I learn about stuff that I might integrate into my magical practice or my work. But like I don't have to. I don't feel like, oh, I have to discover things that I'm going to use. I'm just like, oh, I have to find things that my students will find interesting to write and analyze about, if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense. It does make sense. When you were mentioning playing all these songs that you've sort of like learned over the years, I wanted to suggest to you that maybe the Erie Canal song might be a good addition to your repertoire. You know, it's got a mule in it, so it's sort of Apueleius adjacent. Yeah,
I will definitely think about that. I very rarely read from texts that are not my own, but I do sometimes, like I have performed Idyll II by Theocritus, as part of, well, it's one of the found in Simetha. It's like happens in the beginning and it's wrapped up in kind of a monologue about how men write about witches and what fears they're projecting onto women and femmes and stuff like that. So I have wondered how I could tie Apueleius into something, because it's like so juicy and undertapped in the world of everything. I think like more people should know that, like, if you really take novels seriously, you should read the closest early thing to a novel we have, and it's about a horny donkey. You know, so I will definitely Erie Canal. I'm gonna put that in my
Shrek
brain.
Sequel, basically.
You heard it here
Shrek
first.
prequel.
Yeah, completely. I'm perpetually like, man, I've been 10 years doing this act that's so many covers. Like, how much material is really out there for this? But more and more, Erie Canal, I'm gonna take a look at.
this has been a really amazing conversation. I'm wondering, do you where can people find your stuff online? I'm sure they already know to look in the show notes for this, but why don't you tell them where they can find your stuff?
Yeah, I will say first and foremost that if you order Tea Leaves by Jacob Budenz, you can read a bunch of wacky stories. You can find it kind of anywhere books are sold. If you want to buy it from a local bookstore, you can call them and ask them to order it for you. But you can also get it on, Amazon and shit if that's the best for you. The audiobook is coming out in mid-February, which I'm very excited about. And then if you want to follow the broad schema of my weird performance art life, at Dreambaby Jake on Instagram is usually where I post about most of what I'm doing. But yeah, if you want to do anything,
and you have a website too. What's your website address?
jakebearts.com, jakebearts.com. Instagram is a little more up to date because it's I'll update my website once or twice a year, but I'll always post about what's next on Instagram and stuff. Which I know how that sounds. That's very millennial of me, but it's an easy repository.
But aren't you a millennial?
I am she. Yeah.
I think it's okay. It's okay to do millennial stuff if you're a millennial.
Yeah. It's a good Instagram is a good networking tool for music and stuff I book a lot of shows using Instagram and stuff.
Thank you very much for being on. This was a really interesting conversation. I think we're probably going to have to do a part 2 one of these days so we can get a little bit deeper into the art and witchcraft thing.
Yes.
Because I spent way too long finding out more about the Greco-Roman witchcraft and how it is sort of translated into the modern day, which is a super fascinating topic. But I really want the listeners to know that you've got a lot more to offer, that your art and your writing is really amazing, and that they should go check it out.
Thank you so much. I would love that very much. I feel like I talked almost not at all about my actual spiritual practices and was this is history.
We ran out of time.
But yeah, part 2 sounds great.
We will. Okay, we'll have to set that up, and with that, thank you for being on.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
This has been another episode of the Arnemancy Podcast. Thank you for joining me. I have been your host, Reverend Eric. You can find Arnemancy online at arnemancy.com, and you can subscribe to this podcast anywhere podcasts are found. If you like what you hear, please consider supporting the Arnemancy Project for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/Arnemancy.
This is Vanessa Urena, and I'm really excited to announce my new store, Sword and Scythe, where I will be offering magical art, materia, and services beneath Mars and Saturn. You can visit the store at swordandscythe.com and be sure to sign up for the email list to receive early access to new releases.